Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
There exists, within the sprawling nightmare of humanity's far future, a singular truth that burns brighter than all the stars in the galaxy combined. It is a truth etched into the very foundations of the Imperial Palace on Terra, whispered in the gilded halls where golden warriors stand their eternal vigil, and carried in the hearts of the Emperor's chosen guardians like a brand that can never heal. This truth is simple, devastating, and absolute. The Adeptus Custodes do not fail, and yet they have. To understand what happens when a custodian fails the Emperor, you must first understand what a custodian truly is. These are not mere warriors, not simple soldiers clad in gilded armor and given grandiose titles. The Adeptus Custodes, known in ancient times as the Legio Custodeo, represent something far more profound than martial excellence. They are living manifestations of the Emperor's will, each one a unique masterwork of genetic artistry that took centuries to perfect. Where Space Marines are mass-produced weapons forged from the gene seed of their primarchs, Custodians are individually crafted treasures, each one shaped by the master of mankind's own hands through processes so arcane and complex that only a handful of souls across 10,000 years have ever glimpsed their secrets. The creation of a custodian begins in infancy, with children selected from the noblest families of Terra. But nobility of birth means nothing in this process. What matters is genetic compatibility, psychological resilience, and 1,000 other factors that only the Emperor's gene rights can divine. For every child who enters the transformation process, countless others are deemed unsuitable and turned away. And even among those precious few who are chosen, the path to becoming one of the 10,000 is paved with trials that would break lesser beings utterly. The transformation is not a simple implantation of organs, as it is with the Adeptus Astartes. It is a complete rewriting of the human form at the cellular level, a process that takes solar decades and involves alchemical augmentation, psychomimetic conditioning, and genetic manipulation of such staggering complexity that the Mechanicum's magi can barely comprehend its surface. The child who enters this crucible does not emerge enhanced. They emerge reborn, their every cell saturated with a fragment of the Emperor's own essence. Their bodies and minds transformed into something that transcends humanity while remaining recognizably human in form. When the process is complete, what stands before you is a warrior of such terrible perfection that even the mightiest Space Marine seems crude by comparison. They tower over normal men, their physiques sculpted to an ideal that seems almost mathematical in its precision. Every muscle serves a purpose, every sinew optimized for maximum efficiency. Their golden armor, forged from auramite, mined from the most secure vaults beneath the palace, is not mass-produced, but individually crafted to fit their exact specifications, adorned with their personal heraldry and the names they have earned through deeds of valor. But it is not their physical form that truly sets them apart. It is what burns within them. The Adeptus Custodes are infused with a fraction of the Emperor's own power, a psychic resonance that manifests as an almost supernatural aegis against harm. Bullets meant for their hearts find themselves deflected at the last moment. Blades that should cleave through armor slide away as if repelled by an invisible force. Even the most potent psychic assaults break like waves against the adamantine will of these golden guardians. Some custodians manifest this blessing as a visible halo of light, a radiance that blinds their enemies and forces creatures of the warp to recoil in agony. They do not age as mortals do. Their enhanced physiology maintains them at peak performance for centuries, even millennia. A custodian who fought in the unification wars of ancient Terra might still stand vigil in the 41st millennium, their body as perfect as the day they first donned their armor. They feel neither doubt nor fear in the way that lesser beings do. Their loyalty to the Emperor is not a choice or a conviction. It is woven into the very fabric of their being, as fundamental as breathing, as unquestionable as gravity. Each custodian is a scholar, a philosopher, and a warrior without peer. They are trained not merely in combat, but in every art of war and peace that might aid them in their sacred duty. They understand politics and intrigue, for threats to the emperor come not only from without, but from within. They are masters of stealth and assassination, able to move through crowds unseen or strike from the shadows with lethal precision. They are tacticians and strategists, capable of commanding entire armies or fighting alone against impossible odds. And they are historians and keepers of secrets, entrusted with knowledge so dangerous that its mere existence could shatter the foundations of the Imperium. Unlike space marines, who fight as brothers and squads, bound together by the brotherhood of their chapters, custodians are individualists. Each fights in their own style, wielding weapons tailored to their preferences, employing tactics that reflect their unique understanding of warfare. They do not need the camaraderie of battle brothers, because they do not need anyone. A single custodian can break an enemy charge. A handful can turn the tide of a planetary war. And when the 10,000 march to war together, even the mightiest foes of humanity tremble at the sight of their golden host. This is what a custodian is: perfection given form. The Emperor's will made flesh. A warrior so far beyond the capabilities of normal humanity that they seem like demigods walking among mortals. And it is precisely because of this perfection that their failures cut so deep. The Adeptus Custodes have one purpose, singular and absolute. They exist to protect the Emperor of mankind, not the Imperium, not humanity as a whole, not the ideals for which the Emperor fought, or the dream of a unified galaxy free from the taint of chaos. Their duty is to the person of the Master of mankind himself, to ensure that no harm befalls the greatest being the galaxy has ever known. Every aspect of their training, every moment of their existence, every thought in their enhanced minds circles back to this central truth. They are the Emperor's shield, and they will give everything to ensure his safety. But what does it mean to fail at this duty? For a being of such terrible perfection, where does failure even begin? The answer is both simple and profoundly complex. For a custodian, failure is not measured by the standards that apply to lesser warriors. A space marine who loses a battle but survives to fight again has not failed. An Imperial guardsman who dies holding the line while his comrades retreat has succeeded in his duty even as he falls. But for a custodian, the margin for acceptable performance is so narrow that it might as well not exist at all. Consider the physical decline that all flesh eventually faces. A normal human grows old, their body weakening with the passage of years, until death claims them. A space marine ages far more slowly, but even they eventually feel the weight of centuries bearing down upon them. For a custodian, aging is almost irrelevant. Their enhanced physiology maintains them at peak performance for far longer than any space marine could dream of surviving. And yet, even they are not truly immortal. After 1,000 years of service, after 10,000 battles fought and won, a custodian might notice something that would be imperceptible to anyone else. Their reaction time, once measured in fractions of a second so small that the finest chronometers can barely detect them, has slowed, perhaps by 1/10 of a second, perhaps less. To anyone else, this would be meaningless. They would still be faster than any normal human, faster than most space marines, faster than almost anything in the galaxy. But to a custodian, this fractional decrease represents catastrophic failure. Because that 1/10 of a second might be the difference between deflecting a blade aimed at the Emperor's throat and watching it find its mark. That tiny delay might mean the difference between intercepting an assassin and allowing them to reach the Sanctum Imperialis. In a role where perfection is the only acceptable standard, even the smallest degradation is intolerable. And so, when a custodian begins to feel the weight of ages, when they notice that their once flawless form has developed the barest hint of imperfection, they make a choice that would seem incomprehensible to outsiders. They retire, not because they are forced to, not because their superiors deem them unfit, but because they themselves recognize that they can no longer fulfill their duty to the standard they demand of themselves. They walk to the Hall of Names, that vast chamber within the Imperial Palace where the armor and weapons of fallen custodians are laid to rest, and they surrender their war gear. The golden plate that has protected them through centuries of conflict, the guardian spear that has drunk the blood of countless enemies, the personal heraldry they have earned through deeds that would fill volumes. All of it is placed upon the racks and pedestals, another set among thousands. Then they don the black cloak of the retired custodian, and they vanish from terror, walking out into the galaxy as one of the eyes of the Emperor. These mysterious figures maintain their vows of service in a different way, working alone or cultivating networks of informants across the Imperium. They watch for threats that might harm the Emperor, using fear and intimidation when loyalty will not suffice. They remain vigilant, even in their diminished capacity, constantly searching for dangers and sending warnings back to their brothers through secret channels. It is said that wherever darkness gathers, wherever plots against the Emperor ferment, an eye of the Emperor is watching. For some, even this is not enough. When wounds leave them unable to function at all, when their bodies have been so catastrophically damaged that they can no longer walk or fight, they may request interment within a venerable Contemptor dreadnought. This massive walking tomb allows them to continue serving, their broken flesh sustained by arcane machinery, while their minds remain sharp and focused on their eternal duty. Unlike Space Marine dreadnoughts, who are often allowed to sleep between battles, Custodian dreadnoughts remain awake, standing vigil for centuries, bearing the weight of consciousness without the mercy of rest. But physical degradation, though it represents a kind of failure, is not what truly haunts the Adeptus Custodes. The failures that scar their collective soul run far deeper than the inevitable decay of flesh. These are failures of duty, moments when, despite all their power and perfection, they proved insufficient to protect their charge. There have been such moments throughout the long history of the 10,000, instances where, despite their best efforts, threats slipped through their defenses or enemies proved too numerous to hold back. Each of these failures is recorded in the annals of the Custodian Guard, studied and analyzed so that such mistakes might never be repeated. But one failure eclipses all others. A catastrophe so profound that it has defined the Adeptus Custodes for 10,000 years. One failure that changed everything, the Siege of Terra. To understand the magnitude of this failure, you must understand what preceded it. For 2 centuries, the Emperor's Great Crusade had swept across the galaxy, reuniting the scattered remnants of humanity under the banner of the Imperium. Leading this crusade were the Primarchs, the Emperor's Genesons, superhuman generals, each commanding a legion of Space Marines. The Custodians had stood at the Emperor's side throughout these conquests, an elite force that rarely needed to deploy in full, but whose mere presence struck fear into the hearts of the Emperor's enemies. But ambition and pride can corrupt even the noblest of souls. Horus, the War Master, greatest of the Primarchs and most favored of the Emperor's sons, fell to the seductions of chaos. He turned half the legions against their father and plunged the galaxy into the most destructive civil war humanity has ever known. The Horus heresy tore the Imperium apart, pitting brother against brother, turning the Emperor's perfect vision into a nightmare of betrayal and bloodshed. As the heresy reached its climax, Horus brought his corrupted legions to Terra itself, intent on striking down the Emperor and claiming the throne for himself. The Imperial Palace, that continent-spanning fortress that had stood as a symbol of humanity's unity, became a battlefield. The traitor legions, swollen with demonic allies and twisted by the power of the warp, threw themselves against the palace's defenses with fanatical fury. The Custodians fought, as they had never fought before. They stood alongside the Loyalist Space Marines, the Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars, forming the final bulwark against the tide of corruption that sought to overwhelm Terra. Every corridor of the palace became a killing ground. Every wall was held by warriors who knew that to retreat meant the end of everything they had sworn to protect. But the Custodians were not deployed as they should have been. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, had embarked on a project of staggering ambition, attempting to create a human webway that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel. This project required his constant attention and consumed vast amounts of his psychic might. When Magnus the Red, attempting to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery, shattered the psychic wards protecting the webway, demons poured through the breach in their millions. The Emperor was forced to sit upon the golden throne, using his full power to hold the demonic tide at bay while maintaining the psychic shields that kept the webway from collapsing entirely. And so the Custodians found themselves fighting a war on two fronts. Some stood guard over the Emperor as he sat immobile upon the throne, protecting him from the demons that clawed at the barriers of reality. Others fought alongside the Loyalist legions above, bleeding themselves white to hold back Horus's forces. They fought for 55 days. 55 days of unrelenting combat, of watching their brothers fall, of seeing the palace they had sworn to protect torn apart by bombardment and corruption. The casualties were staggering. The Legio Custodes, which had numbered 10,000 at the war's beginning, saw its ranks depleted to barely 1,000 by the siege's end. Every golden warrior who fell represented an irreplaceable loss, a masterwork destroyed, centuries of experience and skill erased in moments of violence. And then, Horus made his move. Detecting that Loyalist reinforcements were approaching Terra, he lowered the void shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, in orbit above the planet. It was a challenge, a dare, a trap, and the Emperor rose to meet it. The master of mankind could have sent his Custodians alone. He could have ordered them to storm the flagship and slay Horus, avoiding personal risk. But he did not. He chose to lead the assault himself, accompanied by his Primarchs Rogel Dawn and Sanguinius, companies of veteran space marines, and a force of Custodians led by Constantine Valdor himself. They teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and immediately Horus sprung his trap. Using his chaos-granted powers, the War Master scattered the boarding party throughout the massive vessel, separating them and forcing them to fight their way through demon-infested corridors while he waited in his throne room, growing stronger with every moment. The Emperor and his Custodians materialized in what appeared to be an ordinary hangar bay. For a moment, there was stillness, and then the horror began. Horus, at the peak of his demonic power, reached out with his will and did the unthinkable. He took control of the Custodians themselves. These warriors, whose minds were supposed to be inviolate, whose loyalty was supposed to be absolute, found themselves turned into puppets. Blood flowed from their eyes as they fought against the alien presence invading their thoughts. They screamed in anguish as their bodies betrayed them, moving without their consent, raising their weapons not against the Emperor's enemies, but against the Emperor himself. The master of mankind was forced to kill his own bodyguards. The Custodians, even as they attacked, begged for death, unable to stop themselves from obeying the dark compulsion that drove them. The Emperor, with terrible sorrow, granted their pleas, cutting them down even as he worked to cleanse the lingering taint from those who still retained some measure of control. Eventually, the madness passed. The surviving Custodians, traumatized beyond measure, rallied to their master's side and fought their way deeper into the ship, but the damage was done. The invincible Guardians had been turned against the one they were sworn to protect. Their incorruptibility had proven to be a lie. They fought through the Vengeful Spirit's twisted corridors, encountering horrors that would drive lesser beings mad. They watched as Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels, confronted Horus alone and was struck down, his broken body left at the feet of the chaos-sworn War Master as a message to the Emperor. And then the emperor himself entered the throne room. What happened next is known only through fragments and legends. The emperor and Horus fought, father against favored son, and the clash of their powers shook reality itself. Horus, empowered by all four chaos gods, proved to be a match for even the master of mankind. He struck the emperor down, inflicting wounds so grievous that they should have been instantly fatal, and the custodians could do nothing but watch. Constantin Valdor, the first of the 10,000, the greatest warrior the custodian guard has ever produced, could only stand by as his gene father was mortally wounded. The other custodians who had fought their way to that chamber could only bear witness as the emperor, using the last of his strength, obliterated Horus utterly, body and soul, ensuring that the War Master could never return. They carried the emperor's broken body back to Terra. They watched as he was interred upon the golden throne, his consciousness retreating deep within his shattered form to maintain the Astronomicon and hold shut the webway breach. They stood vigil as the emperor became a corpse on life support, his dreams of human enlightenment reduced to ash, his empire transformed from a rational secular state into the superstitious theocracy he had fought to prevent. The Adeptus Custodes had failed in their one duty. The emperor had been struck down, and they had been unable to prevent it. Never mind that Horus was empowered by gods. Never mind that the forces arrayed against them were beyond anything they could have prepared for. Never mind that they had fought with courage and skill beyond measure. They had failed. The emperor was dead in all but the most technical sense, and it was their fault. In the wake of this catastrophe, the custodians made a choice that would define them for the next 10 millennia. They donned black cloaks, symbols of mourning and shame, and they swore an oath of penance. They would never again leave the emperor's side. They would stand vigil over his broken form for eternity, a guard of honor for a fallen god. The galaxy could burn. The Imperium could crumble. It did not matter. They had failed once, and they would never risk failing again. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Custodes remained within the walls of the imperial palace, their numbers slowly dwindling as casualties were sustained in defense of Terra and new custodians were created to replace them. They became myths even to the Space Marines, golden ghosts spoken of in hushed whispers. The greatest warriors humanity had ever produced sat idle while the Imperium tore itself apart through civil wars, Xenos invasions, and demonic incursions. They watched the age of apostasy unfold. When the corrupt High Lord, Goj Vandaya, seized control of the Imperium and unleashed a reign of terror that lasted for decades. They remained in their halls even as entire sectors fell to greenskin hordes or were devoured by tyrannid hive fleets. They stood motionless in the face of 13 Black Crusades launched by the forces of chaos, each one threatening to tear down the Imperium's defenses. Only in the direst circumstances would they act beyond Terra's boundaries. When a force of Eldar Harlequins attempted to infiltrate the Imperial Palace during the War of the Beast, the Custodians struck them down with absolute prejudice. When Gog Vandaya's madness threatened the very survival of the Imperium, a handful of Custodians used secret passages within the palace to bring the leader of the Sisters of Battle before the Emperor himself, setting in motion the events that would end Vandaya's tyranny. But these were exceptions, brief moments when the threat to the Emperor became so immediate that action was required. For the most part, the Adeptus Custodes remained withdrawn, consumed by their shame, convinced that their place was at the Emperor's side and nowhere else. This withdrawal was itself a failure, though one the Custodians refused to acknowledge. The Emperor had not built his Imperium simply to protect his physical form. He had intended to unite humanity, to shepherd mankind into a new golden age, free from the predations of chaos and Xenos threats. By retreating to Terra and refusing to defend the realm he had built, the Custodians were failing him just as surely as they had failed him at the Siege of Terra. Some Custodians recognized this truth. They chafed at the enforced inactivity, watching through intelligence reports and data streams as the Imperium slowly rotted from within. They saw the corruption spreading through the administratum, the dogmatic inflexibility of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the brutal inefficiency of the Imperial Guard. They witnessed the transformation of the Emperor's rational Imperium into the ecclesiarchy's theocratic nightmare, where faith replaced reason and superstition replaced science. And they could do nothing, because the shame of their failure at the Siege of Terror was too great, because admitting that they should be out there, fighting for the Imperium, would mean admitting that 10,000 years of self-imposed penance had been wasted. Because changing course would require confronting the truth that their interpretation of duty had itself been a dereliction of duty. The psychological weight of this failure cannot be overstated. Imagine being created for a single purpose, being engineered to perfection in pursuit of that purpose, dedicating every moment of your existence to that purpose, and then failing spectacularly. Imagine watching your failure echo down through the millennia, seeing the consequences of your inadequacy playing out across the galaxy. Imagine knowing that you are supposed to be perfect, incorruptible, invincible, and having that illusion shattered in the most brutal way possible. For a space marine, failure can be atoned for through renewed dedication. A warrior who breaks can be remade. But the custodians have no such escape. They are already perfect. There is no higher standard to reach for, no greater dedication they can demonstrate. They failed because they were not enough, and there is no way to become more than they already are. Some custodians, faced with this impossible burden, simply stopped, not in the sense of dying, but in the sense of ceasing to be fully present. They stood their vigils, performed their duties, maintained their weapons and armor, but something vital had gone out of them. They became like the servitors that scuttled through the palace corridors, living things following programming, without true awareness or purpose. Others turned their anguish inward, becoming obsessed with perfection to the point of madness. They would spend decades analyzing single moments from the Siege of Terror, searching for the exact instant where they could have done something differently, some action that would have prevented the catastrophe. They tortured themselves with the knowledge that if they had been faster, smarter, more vigilant, the Emperor would still walk among his children. And a very few, found a different path. They embraced the pain of their failure and used it as fuel. They became more proactive in their duties as eyes of the Emperor, ranging across the galaxy to hunt down threats before they could reach Terra. They pushed themselves harder in the blood games, those sacred exercises where custodians attempt to penetrate the palace's defenses by any means necessary, constantly testing and improving the security measures that protected the Emperor. The blood games deserve special attention, as they represent the custodians' attempt to ensure that they never fail again. In these exercises, a custodian is chosen and given a simple mission: find a way to assassinate the Emperor. They are given time to prepare, to gather resources, to plan their approach. Then they shed their golden armor, disguise themselves, and disappear into the sprawling hives of terror. What follows is a deadly game of cat and mouse that can last for months or even years. The custodian must use every skill they possess to bypass the palace's defenses, to move unseen through crowds of billions, to acquire weapons and forge documents and bribe officials. They must think like an assassin, like a terrorist, like a traitor. They must become the enemy they are sworn to destroy, and their fellow custodians must stop them. Every security measure is tested. Every guard is scrutinized. Every protocol is examined for weaknesses. When the assassin finally makes their move, when they stand before the Emperor with a blade raised, they will be intercepted. But the point is not whether they succeed. The point is discovering how close they came, learning what gaps in the defenses allowed them to get that far, understanding what an enemy might do if they were as skilled and dedicated as a custodian. These games are brutal in their honesty. They force the custodians to confront their own fallibility, to acknowledge that their defenses are not perfect, that an enemy sufficiently clever or lucky might find a way through, and they serve as a constant reminder of the cost of failure. Every weakness discovered is a potential avenue for a real assassin. Every near miss in the Blood Games is a prophecy of what might happen if they are not vigilant enough. There have been instances where Blood Games revealed catastrophic security breaches, cults operating within the palace itself.
You know, I've been researching Warhammer for quite a while, and honestly, the Custodes story hits differently than most factions. There's something deeply human about these supposedly perfect beings carrying this immense guilt for 10 millennia. Like, imagine being engineered to be flawless, told you're the Emperor's finest creation, and then watching your one job, the only thing you were made for, end in catastrophic failure. Most factions in 40k are tragic, sure, but the Custodes are tragic in a way that feels almost too real. They can't just die gloriously in battle and be done with it. They have to live with what happened, day after day, century after century. And what gets me is that their redemption isn't about forgetting or being forgiven. It's about choosing to serve anyway, knowing they might fail again. That's what makes them fascinating. They're not heroes because they're perfect. They're heroes because they're broken and they keep going anyway. Back to the story.
Corrupted officials with access to restricted areas. Weaknesses in the defensive grid that a determined enemy could exploit. Each discovery is met with ruthless action. The corrupted are purged, often along with everyone who might have been exposed to their taint. The weaknesses are addressed through new protocols and security measures. The palace's defenses are continually refined and improved. But the Blood Games also serve another purpose. They give custodians a way to process their trauma, to channel their fear of failure into productive action. Every successful penetration of the defenses is a controlled failure, one that can be learned from without catastrophic consequences. Every time they catch the assassin before they can strike, they prove to themselves that they can prevent another siege of terror. Yet even the Blood Games cannot erase the fundamental truth that haunts every custodian. They have already failed once, and that failure shaped the entire history of the Imperium. Consider what might have been different if the Emperor had not been struck down. The Great Crusade would have continued, potentially reuniting all of humanity under a single banner. The Webway project would have been completed, giving humanity a means of travel that did not rely on the warp and thus could not be disrupted by chaos. The Imperium would have remained a secular state built on reason and science, rather than degenerating into the superstitious theocracy it became. The Space Marine legions would not have been broken into chapters, weakening humanity's most powerful military force. The Primarchs would not have been lost or fallen to chaos, depriving the Imperium of its greatest generals and warriors. The slow rot of bureaucracy and dogma would not have set in, because the Emperor would have been there to guide his realm and make corrections as needed. All of this lost because the custodians failed. All of this suffering, all of this decline, all of this darkness happening on their watch. They know this. They feel it. It is a weight that presses down on them with every moment of every day. A guilt so profound that it has become the defining characteristic of their existence. And yet, for all their self-recrimination, for all their shame, there is a strange pride that mingles with it. They failed, yes, but they failed protecting the most important being in the galaxy against impossible odds. They fought demons and traitors and corrupted Primarchs. They stood their ground when worlds were burning and the sky itself was tearing apart. They gave everything they had, and it was not enough, but they gave it anyway. This contradiction, this mixture of shame and pride, creates a strange psychology. The custodians are simultaneously the most humble and the most arrogant warriors in the Imperium. They know they are not infallible because they have failed. But they also know that they are still the finest warriors humanity has ever produced. They approach their duty with the solemnity of those who have seen the consequences of failure, but also with the confidence of those who know that no one else can do what they do. This psychology manifests in interesting ways when custodians interact with other imperial forces. They are not unkind, but they maintain a distance, an aloofness that speaks to their unique position. They do not see themselves as part of the Imperium in the way that Space Marines or Imperial Guard do. They serve the Emperor, not the Imperium. The distinction is subtle but crucial. When the Space Marines speak of serving the Emperor's will, they mean protecting humanity and fighting his enemies. When the Custodians speak of serving the Emperor, they mean the literal, physical person of the master of mankind. This has led to conflicts over the millennia, situations where the broader strategic needs of the Imperium clashed with the Custodians' singular focus on protecting the Emperor's physical form. During the Age of Apostasy, the Custodians could have ended Gog Vandira's reign of terror immediately. They had the authority and the capability. But they did not, because Vandire, for all his corruption and madness, did not pose a direct threat to the Emperor. It was only when the situation became so dire that it threatened the stability of terror itself that a few Custodians acted, and even then, they did so in the most minimal way possible, simply facilitating a meeting rather than taking direct action. This narrow interpretation of duty has frustrated many Imperial commanders over the centuries. Why keep such powerful warriors locked away on terror when they could be turning the tide of critical battles across the galaxy? Why allow the Imperium to burn when the Adeptus Custodes could extinguish the flames? The answer, always, is that the Custodians serve the Emperor, not the Imperium. And the Emperor sits upon the golden throne, which means that is where the Custodians must be. Or at least, that was the answer. Until everything changed. The opening of the Great Rift in the dying years of the 41st Millennium brought catastrophe on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy. A massive warp storm split the galaxy in two, cutting off half the Imperium from Terra's light. Demons poured into real space in numbers beyond counting. Chaos cults rose up on thousands of worlds simultaneously. The Imperium teetered on the brink of total collapse, and then, impossibly, a Primarch returned. Robuta Guilliman, the Lord of Ultramar, was resurrected through means both technological and mystical. He fought his way to terror through the madness of the Great Rift, leading what would come to be known as the Terran Crusade. When his fleet arrived at Luna, the Custodians watched through their intelligence networks as the Primarch battled the forces of Magnus the Red, the demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns. The current Captain General, Trajan Valoris, made a decision then that would change the nature of the Adeptus Custodes forever. He ordered a force of Custodians to deploy to Luna and reinforce Guilliman. It was the first time in 10,000 years that Custodians had left Terra in significant numbers for a purpose other than defending the Emperor's physical form. They arrived just in time to turn the tide of the battle, their golden armor blazing with holy light as they crashed into Magnus's forces. The demon Primarch was driven back, and Guilliman was able to continue his journey to Terra. But the real shock came shortly after his arrival. The birth of the Great Rift sent shockwaves through the warp, and one of these shockwaves manifested as a massive demonic incursion directly onto Terra itself. A horde of cornate demons burst through the fabric of reality and assaulted the Imperial Palace in what became known as the Second Battle of Terra, or the Battle of Lion's Gate. This was the Adeptus Custodes' worst nightmare made real. A direct assault on the Emperor, the very scenario they had spent 10,000 years preparing to prevent. Captain General Valoris personally led 4,000 Custodians from the Lion's Gate to meet the demonic horde, enacting protocols that had been crafted over millennia of preparation. The battle was apocalyptic. Demons in their thousands, empowered by the Blood God himself, clashed against the Golden Warriors who had sworn to never let another enemy reach the Emperor's throne. The Custodians fought with a fury born of 10 millennia of shame and determination, each one knowing that this was their chance to prove that they would not fail again. Robut Guilliman and his Ultramarines fought beside them, the Primarch wielding the Emperor's own flaming sword. a relic he had been gifted after standing before the Golden Throne. Together, the combined force managed to drive back the demonic incursion, banishing the servants of Khorne back to the warp. But the cost was steep. Custodians fell in numbers not seen since the Siege of Terror, each death a wound to the collective soul of the 10,000. In the battle's aftermath, Valoris and Guilliman met to discuss the future. The Primarch was blunt in his assessment. The Adeptus Custodes could no longer afford to remain sequestered on Terra. The Imperium was under assault from every direction, and its finest warriors were sitting idle out of misplaced guilt. The best defense was no longer found behind the palace ramparts. Sometimes, the best way to protect the Emperor was to strike at his enemies before they could threaten him. Valoris, to the shock of many of his brothers, agreed. He had seen the daimonic incursion reach the very gates of the palace. He had watched as enemies who should never have gotten close to Terra materialized directly onto the Emperor's doorstep. The old strategy of pure defense had failed. A new approach was needed. With Guilliman's support, Valoris convinced the High Lords of Terra to suspend the ancient edict of restraint that had kept the Custodians confined to Terra. The Adeptus Custodes would join the Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman's massive military campaign to stabilize the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift. They would take the fight to the enemies of mankind, striking at threats before they could reach the throne world. For many Custodians, this decision felt like liberation. After 10,000 years of standing idle while the galaxy burned, they could finally act. They could prove that their failure at the Siege of Terra was not the end of their story. They could show that the Adeptus Custodes were not broken, not defeated, not reduced to ceremonial guards standing watch over a corpse. But for others, it felt like betrayal. They had sworn oaths of penance, vows to never leave the Emperor's side. Changing that now seemed to diminish the meaning of those 10,000 years of vigil. If it had been acceptable all along to deploy across the galaxy, then what had they been doing? Had their self-imposed exile been pointless? Had they wasted millennia that could have been spent defending the Imperium? These questions created divisions within the Adeptus Custodes, conflicts that had to be carefully managed by Valoris and his tribunes. Some Custodians eagerly volunteered for deployment with the Indomitus Crusade, seeing it as a chance to redeem themselves. Others requested to remain on Terra, maintaining the vigil they had kept for so long. Valoris had to balance these competing desires while ensuring that enough Custodians remained to defend the palace. In the end, a compromise was reached. A rotating cadre of Custodians would deploy with the various fleets of the Indomitus Crusade, serving as Guilliman's direct representatives and bearing the authority of the Emperor himself. 300 Custodians would remain as the companions, standing eternal vigil in the throne room where the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne. The rest would be divided between defensive duties on Terra and various missions across the Imperium. This new doctrine represented a fundamental shift in how the Adeptus Custodes understood their duty. They were no longer purely reactive, waiting for threats to come to them. They were proactive, hunting down enemies before they could become dangers. They were no longer isolated from the rest of the Imperium, standing apart in their golden splendor. They were engaged, working alongside other Imperial forces to achieve common goals. But this change also brought new challenges and new opportunities for failure. Deploying across the galaxy meant operating in unfamiliar environments, facing enemies they had not studied for millennia, working with allies who did not understand their ways. It meant accepting that they could not be everywhere at once, that protecting the Imperium might sometimes mean leaving Terra less defended. In the campaigns that followed, the Custodians proved their worth time and again. At the Battle of Gathalamor, Valoris led a combined force of Custodians and Grey Knights against the Wordbearers, routing the traitor legion and recovering sacred relics. In the Fourth Tyrannic War, Custodian strike forces deployed against the Tyrannid hive fleets, their precision strikes destroying synapse creatures and disrupting the alien coordination. But they also faced defeats. Custodians fell in battles across the galaxy, their irreplaceable expertise lost forever. Some became separated from Imperial forces during warp travel and were never heard from again. Others were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, even their legendary skill insufficient against the endless hordes that assailed them. Each loss was felt acutely by the surviving custodians, a reminder that they were not invincible, that failure was always possible. But there was a difference now. These failures were not the result of standing idle. They were the result of taking action, of fighting rather than hiding behind walls. And while the pain of loss was still sharp, there was a sense that this was the right path, that the Emperor would have wanted his guardians to fight for his Imperium rather than mourning in seclusion. There is a particular incident that illustrates the modern custodian's approach to failure, one that has become something of a legend among those few who know of it. During the Indomitus Crusade, a small force of custodians was assigned to protect a convoy carrying Primaris Space Marine reinforcements to a beleaguered chapter in the Imperium Nihilus. The convoy came under attack by a massive Chaos fleet, and in the ensuing battle, the custodians found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. A traditional custodian approach, the doctrine that had prevailed for 10,000 years, would have been to form a defensive perimeter around the most critical transport and hold it at all costs. If the convoy was lost, so be it, as long as the custodians maintained their positions and did not retreat. But the shield captain in command of the force made a different choice. He ordered his custodians to scatter, each one taking command of a different transport and leading the crews in evasive maneuvers. Rather than standing their ground, they ran, using speed and cunning to evade the Chaos ships, while simultaneously calling for reinforcements. It was a risk, spreading their forces thin and relying on tactics that emphasized survival over stubborn defense. For 3 days, the scattered convoy fled through the warp, pursued by Chaos forces that sought to destroy them. The custodians coordinated the civilian crews, compensated for their inexperience with their own skill, and kept the transports ahead of their pursuers through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer audacity. When Imperial Navy reinforcements finally arrived, not a single transport had been lost. The shield captain's after-action report was studied carefully by the Custodian High Command. By the standards of their 10,000-year vigil, his actions might have been seen as cowardice, an abandonment of proper custodian doctrine. But by the standards of the new approach, of proactive defense and flexible tactics, his actions had been exemplary. He had adapted to the situation, prioritized the mission's success over his own glory, and achieved total victory. This incident represented a new kind of custodian, one shaped by the lessons of both their ancient failure and their modern redemption. These warriors still carried the shame of the Siege of Terror, but they had learned to channel it into something productive. They understood that perfection was impossible, but that the pursuit of perfection was still worthwhile. They recognized that failure was always a possibility, but that the fear of failure should not paralyze them into inaction. Not all custodians have embraced this new doctrine. There are still those who believe that the old ways were correct, that the Adeptus Custodes should have remained on Terra no matter the cost. These traditionalists argue that every custodian lost in the Indomitus Crusade is one less defender available when the next great assault on Terra comes. They point to the Battle of Lion's Gate as proof that the real threats come to Terra, not from Terra, and that the custodian's place is at the Emperor's side. The debate continues, conducted in the halls of the Imperial Palace, in voices that are measured and calm, but weighted with millennia of experience and pain. Both sides make valid points. Both are motivated by genuine devotion to the Emperor and fear of repeating their ancient failure. The resolution, if there ever is one, will shape the future of the Adeptus Custodes for millennia to come. What is clear is that failure has defined the Adeptus Custodes in ways both terrible and transformative. They are warriors who have tasted defeat and can never forget its bitterness. They are guardians who failed to prevent the greatest catastrophe in human history. They are heroes who stood vigil for 10,000 years out of shame and devotion. And they are now, tentatively, warriors reborn, taking their first steps back into a galaxy that desperately needs them. The question that haunts every custodian, whether they stand in the throne room or fight on distant battlefields, is simple. What happens if we fail again? What happens if, despite everything we have learned, despite all our preparation and dedication, we prove insufficient once more? What happens if another enemy reaches the Emperor, if another blow falls that we cannot prevent? The answer, they have learned, is that they endure, they adapt. They learn from their mistakes and they continue their vigil because that is what they were made to do. Failure for a custodian is not the end. It is a wound that never fully heals, a burden that never fully lifts, but it is also a teacher and a goad and a reminder of why their duty matters. They know now what they did not know at the Siege of Terra, that perfection is not the absence of failure, but the refusal to be broken by it. That duty is not about never falling short, but about standing up again when you do. That loyalty is measured not by an unbroken record of success, but by the willingness to keep fighting even after you have lost everything. So what happens when a custodian fails the Emperor? They carry the weight of that failure for eternity. They analyze it, learn from it, do everything in their power to ensure it never happens again. Some retire, becoming eyes of the Emperor, watching for threats from the shadows. Some request interment in dreadnoughts, refusing to stop serving even when their bodies fail them. Some simply stand vigil, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, a living monument to both devotion and shame. But most importantly, they continue. They do not give up. They do not surrender to despair. They acknowledge their imperfection, and they strive for perfection anyway, knowing they will fall short and striving nonetheless. Because that is what it means to be a custodian. Not to be perfect, but to serve perfectly imperfect service with absolute dedication. The Siege of Terra happened 10,000 years ago, but for the Adeptus Custodes, it might as well have been yesterday. The wound is still fresh, the pain still sharp. Every custodian carries it with them, a brand on their soul that can never be removed. But they have learned to live with it, to let it strengthen them rather than destroy them. And in the dark millennium that is the 41st thousand years since the birth of mankind, when the galaxy burns and demons claw at the boundaries of reality and enemies beyond counting mass at the gates, the Adeptus Custodes stand ready. They have failed before. They will probably fail again, but they will never stop trying to succeed, never stop fighting to protect the Emperor, never stop being the golden guardians that he created them to be. This is the true measure of what happens when a custodian fails the Emperor. They become more than they were. They become warriors who understand the cost of defeat and fight anyway. They become guardians who know their limitations and guard anyway. They become the 10,000, golden and terrible, bearing the weight of history and the hope of humanity's future. And they stand vigil, eternal and unyielding, because that is what they were made for. Not to be perfect, but to protect. Not to never fail, but to never stop trying. Not to be invincible, but to be unbreakable. In the end, that is enough. It has to be. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the alternative is unthinkable. The custodians failed once, and the galaxy has been burning ever since. If they fail again, there might be nothing left to protect, so they do not fail. Or rather, they fail, as all mortal things must eventually fail, but they fail forward, learning and adapting and growing stronger with each setback. They carry their shame like a banner, a reminder of what is at stake and why their duty matters. They transform their greatest defeat into their greatest strength, their most profound failure into their deepest dedication. And in doing so, they become something that transcends their original purpose. They are no longer just the Emperor's bodyguards. They are the living embodiment of what it means to serve in the face of impossible odds, to maintain hope in the darkest of times, to find redemption not through forgetting your failures, but through learning from them. This is the legacy of the Adeptus Custodes. This is what happens when perfection fails and chooses to continue anyway. This is the story of warriors who were meant to be invincible, discovered they were not, and found a way to be stronger because of it. The golden armor still gleams in the halls of the Imperial Palace. The guardian spears still stand ready, their blades sharp and their bolters loaded. The companions still maintain their vigil in the throne room, standing in perfect silence around the golden throne. And across the galaxy, in 1,000 different war zones, custodians fight and bleed and die, protecting an Imperium that barely knows they exist. They do this knowing that they might fail, knowing that their best might not be enough, knowing that the Emperor they serve is already lost, preserved only as a psychic echo within a failing machine. But they do it anyway, because that is what duty means. Not serving when success is guaranteed, but serving when failure is possible and choosing to fight anyway. So if you ever find yourself wondering what happens when a custodian fails the Emperor, remember this: they do not break, they do not surrender, they do not despair. They simply carry the weight of their failure, learn from it, and continue their eternal vigil. Because in the end, that is all anyone can do, custodian or otherwise. Face your failures, learn from them, and keep moving forward. The Golden Warriors stand ready. They have failed before. They will fail again. But they will never stop trying to succeed. And in a galaxy as dark as the one in which we find ourselves, that stubborn refusal to give up might be the only thing standing between humanity and total annihilation. So raise your eyes to the Emperor's throne and spare a thought for the 10,000 who guard it. They are not perfect, they are not invincible, they are not unbeatable, but they are unbreakable, and in the end, that is what matters most. If you've enjoyed diving deep into the lore of the Adeptus Custodes and understanding the weight they carry with every moment of their eternal vigil, please consider supporting this channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. There's so much more to explore in the dark universe of Warhammer 40K, from the fallen Primarchs who betrayed their father to the ancient horrors that lurk in the void between stars. Each story reveals another layer of this incredible universe, another perspective on what it means to serve, to fight, and to endure in the face of impossible odds. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also duty, honor, and the refusal to surrender even in the face of certain defeat.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.